In the quiet shadows of Windsor Castle, away from the cameras and crowds, an aging king removes a ring that has bound him to duty for longer than most people live. The sovereign's ring, worn by British monarchs for centuries, slides slowly from weathered fingers as King Charles III faces the most profound decision of his reign. This isn't just about passing on jewelry. It's about the moment when a father realizes that the crown he waited 74 years to wear has become too heavy, not just for him, but for the very institution he swore to protect. What drives a man who spent his entire life preparing for kingship to consider stepping aside? What conversations happen behind closed doors when the weight of tradition meets the reality of age, health, and a changing world? This is the untold story of a private moment that could reshape the British monarchy forever, where duty battles with love, and where a king must choose between holding on to power and ensuring the survival of the crown itself. The ring that once symbolized absolute authority now trembles in hands that have signed thousands of documents, shaken hands with world leaders, and blessed countless lives. But today, it represents something different. A choice that will echo through history and determine whether the House of Windsor adapts to survive or clings to tradition until it crumbles. The morning mist clung to the grounds of Windsor Castle like a shroud, matching the somber mood that had settled over King Charles III as he stood before the tall windows of his private study. At 75, his reflection showed a man marked by decades of waiting, months of reigning, and years of carrying burdens that few could understand. The sovereign's ring, heavy on his finger, caught the pale autumn light as he turned it absently, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing, yet today felt different. Dr. Barber, Margaret Whitfield, had left just an hour earlier, her medical bag clicking shut with the finality that seemed to punctuate every conversation these days. The diagnosis hadn't been unexpected, but hearing it spoken aloud, in the clinical terms doctors favored, made it real in a way that Charles had been avoiding. The cancer, detected early but aggressive in its cellular rebellion, would require treatments that would leave him weakened, absent from public duties for months, possibly longer. The institution he had spent 7 decades preparing to serve would need leadership he might not be able to provide. Charles moved away from the window, his footsteps muffled by Persian carpets that had witnessed the private struggles of monarchs before him. The study, lined with leather-bound books and portraits of his predecessors, felt both comforting and accusatory. His mother, Queen Elizabeth II, gazed down from her official portrait, painted in her prime when duty and determination seemed to radiate from every brushstroke. She had ruled for 70 years, never wavering, never showing weakness, never considering that the crown might be too heavy to bear. But she had also lived in a different world, one where the monarchy's relevance wasn't questioned daily on social media platforms, where Republican movements didn't gain traction with each royal misstep, where the very concept of hereditary privilege wasn't dissected by every news cycle. The irony wasn't lost on him that after waiting longer than any heir in British history, his reign might be among the shortest. Charles had ascended to the throne at an age when most men were settling into retirement, bringing with him decades of preparation, but also the accumulated weight of modern skepticism about monarchy itself. The institution he now headed faced challenges his mother had never encountered: climate change activism that questioned royal environmental impact, social media scrutiny that made privacy impossible, and a generation of young Britons who saw hereditary privilege as an anachronism rather than tradition. His private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, had briefed him that morning about the latest polling numbers. Public support for the monarchy remained stable but not enthusiastic, hovering at levels that suggested tolerance rather than devotion. More concerning were the demographic breakdowns, showing that support dropped dramatically among younger citizens, the very people who would determine the institution's future. Every public appearance was analyzed not just for its immediate impact, but for what it revealed about the monarchy's relevance in an increasingly egalitarian society. Charles walked to his desk, where a stack of red boxes awaited his attention. These leather-bound containers, arriving daily filled with government documents requiring royal assent, represented the mechanical aspect of constitutional monarchy that most citizens never saw. Each signature, each ceremonial approval, each formal acknowledgement of parliamentary decisions reinforced his role as the symbolic head of state, whose power existed in constitutional theory rather than practical reality. Yet even these routine tasks had become more challenging as his hands stiffened with age and his energy flagged under the weight of constant public scrutiny. The telephone calls from his sons had been carefully neutral, their concern masked by the formal language that royal protocol demanded, even in private conversations. William, now Prince of Wales, had inherited not just the title, but the burden of being next in line for a throne that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. Harry's absence from these family consultations spoke to deeper wounds that had never fully healed, leaving the succession planning to fall entirely on William's shoulders. Charles wondered if he was preparing his eldest son for leadership or simply passing along a burden that might crush another generation of Windsors. The global context made everything more complicated. Other European monarchies had adapted by becoming more accessible, more informal, more obviously relevant to modern citizens' daily lives. The Swedish and Dutch royal families had successfully repositioned themselves as working symbols of national unity rather than distant figures of hereditary privilege. But Britain's monarchy carried different baggage, weighted down by imperial history, constitutional complexity, and the impossible standard set by Elizabeth II's remarkable longevity. Charles had inherited not just a crown, but expectations shaped by 7 decades of his mother's steady, unchanging presence. His thoughts turned to Camilla, who had navigated her own transformation from controversial figure to accepted queen consort with grace that had surprised even long-time royal observers. She understood better than anyone the personal cost of royal duty, having witnessed firsthand how the institution consumed individual identity in service of collective symbolism. Their private conversations about his health had been marked by a realism that royal protocol usually discouraged. Acknowledgements that duty and mortality might conflict in ways that required unprecedented decisions. The constitutional implications of any major decision weighed heavily on Charles's mind. Unlike other European monarchies where abdication had modern precedents, British tradition held that kings and queens reigned until death. His great-uncle Edward VIII's abdication in 1936 remained the cautionary tale against putting personal desires before institutional stability, though the circumstances were vastly different. Edward had abdicated for love in a time of constitutional crisis. Charles would be considering abdication for the institution's preservation in an era of republican questioning. The Commonwealth added another layer of complexity to any decision about his reign's future. 15 realms beyond Britain recognized him as head of state, their constitutions linked to the British crown, in ways that made any significant change a matter of international law rather than merely domestic politics. Jamaica, Australia, and Canada had all seen growing republican movements, their politicians calculating whether maintaining ties to the British monarchy served their national interests. Charles's effectiveness as a unifying figure across such diverse nations would largely determine whether the Commonwealth realms remained monarchies or chose republican alternatives. Palace advisors had been carefully studying the mechanics of various scenarios, though such discussions remained theoretical and closely guarded. The government would need to be consulted, Parliament would require special sessions, and constitutional experts would need to navigate legal waters that hadn't been tested in modern times. The logistics alone were staggering. New oaths of allegiance, revised government documents, updated military commissions, and countless ceremonial protocols that would need modification. Yet beneath all these practical considerations lay deeper questions about democratic legitimacy and hereditary privilege that had no easy answers. Charles returned to the window, watching as tourists gathered at the castle gates, their cameras ready to capture glimpses of royal life that revealed nothing about the private struggles occurring behind these ancient walls. They came seeking connection to something larger than themselves, some sense of historical continuity that the monarchy represented even in its diminished modern form. Their presence reminded him that millions of people around the world found meaning in the institution he embodied, regardless of his personal doubts about its sustainability. The sovereign's ring felt heavier than usual as he considered the weight of decision that lay ahead. Every choice would be scrutinized, analyzed, and judged by historians who had the luxury of perfect hindsight. But history was made by people facing uncertain futures, making imperfect decisions with incomplete information, hoping that their choices served something greater than their individual comfort. The ring that symbolized his authority might soon need to find a new finger, and that transition would require conversations that had never occurred in Windsor Castle's long history. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the study, Charles knew that the most difficult discussions of his life lay ahead. The crown that he had waited so long to wear might indeed prove too heavy, but determining its proper weight would require honesty about duty, family, and the future of an institution that had survived far greater challenges than one king's mortality. The ring turned slowly on his finger as he considered calling William, knowing that some conversations, once begun, changed everything forever. The call came at precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon. As Charles had requested, William's voice carried the measured tone that years of royal training had instilled, but beneath the formal words his father detected the concern that protocol couldn't entirely mask. "Father," Sir Clive mentioned you wished to speak privately. The pause that followed spoke volumes about the unusual nature of such a summons, given that their official schedules typically dictated when and where royal family members interacted. Charles stood in his private drawing room, a space less formal than his study, but still heavy with the weight of royal history. Portraits of previous monarchs lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to observe this moment that could alter the very institution they had served. William, I need you to come to Windsor tomorrow evening, not for any official business, but for a conversation that we should have had months ago. The careful phrasing was necessary even on secured palace telephone lines, where every word might be recorded for historical archives or security purposes. Of course, Father. Should Catherine and I adjust our weekend plans? William's question revealed his understanding that this wasn't a routine family gathering. The Prince and Princess of Wales had learned to read the subtle codes that royal communication required, distinguishing between ceremonial obligations and genuinely urgent matters. Charles could hear the slight tension in his son's voice, the awareness that such private summons usually preceded significant announcements. Just you, if you don't mind. This is a conversation between us, about matters that affect the future. Charles paused, knowing that his next words would set events in motion that couldn't be reversed. Bring your seal ring, William. We may need to discuss its significance. The reference to the Prince of Wales ring, worn by heirs to the throne for centuries, would signal to William that this meeting concerned succession in ways that ordinary family conversations never did. After ending the call, Charles felt the strange relief that came from committing to a path he had been contemplating for weeks. The decision to involve William directly represented a departure from royal tradition, which typically kept succession planning abstract until absolutely necessary. But these weren't ordinary times, and the challenges facing the monarchy required more transparency than previous generations had considered appropriate. The institution's survival might depend on honest conversations between the generations who would determine its future direction. The next 24 hours passed with excruciating normalcy. Charles attended his scheduled meetings, reviewed government documents, and participated in the routine activities that filled every monarch's day. But beneath this surface of royal duty, he found himself studying everything with new awareness, wondering how many more times he would perform these familiar rituals. The stake papers seemed more mundane than usual, their constitutional significance unchanged, but their personal relevance somehow diminished. Each signature felt like it might be among his last as a reigning sovereign, rather than a king emeritus. Palace staff noticed nothing unusual in Charles's demeanor, testament to decades of royal training that had taught him to maintain composure regardless of personal circumstances. The ability to separate private turmoil from public function was perhaps the most essential skill any monarch could master, developed through years of appearing calm during family crises, international tensions, and constitutional challenges. Even his closest advisors detected only the slight distraction that might be attributed to his recent medical diagnosis, rather than any fundamental questioning of his reign's continuation. Evening arrived with the crisp clarity that October often brought to Windsor. William's car appeared in the castle's private courtyard precisely on schedule, his punctuality reflecting both royal training and genuine respect for his father's time. Charles watched from his window as William emerged from the vehicle, noting how his eldest son carried himself with the confident bearing that years of public service had developed. At 41, William had grown into his role as Prince of Wales, with a naturalness that Charles remembered struggling to achieve at the same age. Their greeting was warm but formal, years of protocol making casual affection difficult, even in private settings. William wore a dark suit appropriate for evening meetings, his appearance carefully calculated to show respect for both the occasion and his father's position. The Prince of Wales ring gleamed on his right hand, its significance about to become more relevant than either man could have anticipated when William first began wearing it. Charles led his son through corridors lined with paintings and artifacts that told the story of British monarchy across centuries of triumph and crisis. These walls had witnessed countless private conversations that shaped national history, from wartime strategy sessions to family disputes that affected constitutional stability. Tonight's discussion would add another chapter to that hidden history, one that might prove as significant as any diplomatic negotiation or military planning session these rooms had hosted. They settled in Charles's private sitting room, a space decorated with personal photographs and mementos that revealed the human side of royal life. Pictures of William and Harry as children competed for space with formal portraits of state occasions, while books on environmental conservation and architectural history reflected Charles's longtime personal interests. The contrast between public grandeur and private intimacy made the room feel like a sanctuary where honest conversation might actually be possible. "Father, you mentioned my ring specifically. I assume this conversation concerns more than family matters. William's directness surprised Charles, though it shouldn't have. His son had developed a strategic intelligence through years of military service and royal duties, learning to identify crucial information quickly and address it without unnecessary ceremony. The younger generation of royals had been trained for efficiency in ways that previous monarchs might have considered unseemly. Charles nodded, removing his own signet ring and placing it on the small table between their chairs. The gesture was more symbolic than practical, but symbols carry tremendous weight in an institution built on ceremonial tradition. William, I've been thinking about the future of the monarchy, about what we owe the institution and what it owes us in return. Recent events have forced me to consider whether my reign serves the Crown's interests or merely fulfills personal expectations. The medical diagnosis remained unspoken between them, but its presence filled the room like an unwelcome guest. William had been briefed about his father's condition by royal physicians, understanding both the immediate implications and the longer-term challenges that treatment would create. The Prince of Wales had already begun quietly assuming additional responsibilities, though these adjustments had been presented as temporary measures rather than permanent shifts in royal duties. The question isn't whether I can continue reigning, Charles continued, but whether I should. The monarchy faces challenges that require energy, vision, and perhaps most importantly, time to develop long-term strategies. At my age, with my health concerns, I may not be the person best equipped to guide the institution through the changes ahead. The admission came more easily than Charles had expected, years of private doubt finally finding expression in words. William listened without interrupting, his expression revealing the careful consideration he was giving to each statement. Years of royal training had taught him to process information thoroughly before responding, especially when family conversations touched on constitutional matters. The Prince of Wales understood that this discussion would affect not just their personal relationship, but the entire structure of modern monarchy. "Father, are you suggesting abdication?" The question was asked quietly, but its implications thundered through the room like cannon fire. The word itself carried historical baggage that made it almost taboo in British royal circles, associated with crisis and failure rather than strategic planning. Yet William's tone suggested he was prepared to discuss even this possibility if his father believed it served the institution's interests. Charles met his son's gaze directly, seeing in William's eyes the same sense of duty that had driven royal decision-making for generations. "I am suggesting that we consider all options for ensuring the monarchy's continued relevance and effectiveness. That might include my stepping aside while I still have the strength to guide a transition, rather than clinging to the throne until circumstances force change upon us." The words felt revolutionary even as he spoke them, challenging centuries of tradition with pragmatic reasoning. The conversation that followed would last deep into the night, exploring constitutional precedents, public opinion polling, and family considerations that would affect any major decision about royal succession. But the crucial moment had already passed, when Charles first articulated the possibility that duty might require him to surrender power rather than exercise it until death. The sovereign's ring sat on the table between father and son, waiting to learn whose finger would ultimately bear its weight. Outside Windsor Castle's windows, Britain slept peacefully, unaware that its future was being decided in a private conversation between two men who carried the weight of centuries on their shoulders. The crown that had seemed too heavy for one king might soon pass to another, but only if they could navigate the complex waters of tradition, duty, and change that lay ahead. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 11 times as William finally removed his own ring, placing it beside his father's on the small mahogany table. The gesture created a moment of profound symbolism that neither man could ignore. 2 generations of royal service represented by circles of gold that had witnessed centuries of British history. The rings caught the lamplight differently, Charles's worn smooth by decades of nervous turning, while William's still showed the sharp edges of recent craftsmanship. "If we're truly considering this path," William said carefully, "we need to understand the constitutional mechanics and the public implications. This isn't just about our family anymore." His words carried the weight of someone who had been preparing for kingship his entire life, though not necessarily at this moment or under these circumstances. The Prince of Wales had always assumed he would have more time to develop his royal identity before assuming the full burden of the crown. Charles appreciated his son's methodical approach, recognizing the careful planning that military service and royal training had instilled. "I've asked Sir Clive to research the legal requirements discreetly. The government would need to be involved, but we should understand our options before initiating any formal conversations." The mention of government involvement highlighted the complexity of modern monarchy, Where royal decisions required political cooperation and public acceptance to succeed, they spent the next hour examining historical precedents that offered little direct guidance for their situation. Edward VIII's abdication had been driven by personal desire rather than strategic planning, creating constitutional chaos that took months to resolve. Other European monarchies had managed planned transitions more smoothly, but their political systems differed significantly from Britain's complex arrangements. The challenge would be presenting any change as strengthening the monarchy rather than admitting its failure under current leadership. The public perception issue concerns me most, William admitted, his strategic mind already working through potential scenarios. Any transition would need to be seen as positive evolution rather than crisis management. The Republican movement would certainly interpret abdication as evidence that the monarchy is failing. His concern reflected deep understanding of how modern media cycles could transform royal decisions into political controversies that damaged the institution's long-term credibility. Charles nodded, having wrestled with the same concerns during sleepless nights since his diagnosis. That's precisely why we need to control the narrative from the beginning. This can't appear to be a decision forced by illness or age, but rather a strategic choice made for the monarchy's benefit. The challenge would be timing any announcement to maximize positive interpretation while minimizing speculation about hidden motivations or family conflicts. The conversation turned to more personal considerations that constitutional documents never addressed. William's children were still young, their lives about to become significantly more complicated if their father ascended to the throne ahead of schedule. Catherine had adapted brilliantly to her role as Princess of Wales, but becoming Queen Consort would require adjustments that affected the entire family dynamic. The ripple effects of royal succession touched dozens of lives in ways that outsiders rarely considered. Catherine and I have discussed this possibility, though not in concrete terms, William revealed, suggesting that the Prince and Princess of Wales had been preparing mentally for accelerated succession even before tonight's conversation. She understands that our roles might change more quickly than we originally anticipated. The children are our primary concern, but they're adapting well to their current level of public attention. Charles felt both relief and guilt at his son's words. Relief that William and Catherine were psychologically prepared for increased responsibility, guilt that his health issues might force premature changes to their family life. The burden of royal duty had already claimed much of his own relationship with his sons during their childhood. He hoped that pattern wouldn't repeat with his grandchildren under accelerated circumstances.
There's another consideration we haven't discussed, Charles said quietly.
Harry's absence from these conversations. Any major change in succession timing affects him as well, and his current relationship with the family complicates public perception of our decision-making process. The mention of his younger son brought visible tension to William's posture, highlighting wounds that remained unhealed despite years of attempted reconciliation. William's expression hardened slightly, years of frustration with his brother's public criticisms of royal life influencing his response. Harry made his choice to step away from royal duties. He can't expect to influence major institutional decisions after publicly criticizing the very system we're trying to preserve. The harsh words reflected the Prince of Wales' protective instincts regarding the monarchy, but also revealed how family divisions complicated strategic planning. Nevertheless, he remains my son and your brother, Charles replied gently. Any significant change would affect him, and the public would notice his exclusion from family discussions. We need to consider whether reaching out might serve the institution's interests regardless of our personal feelings. The suggestion hung in the air between them, highlighting how duty often required setting aside personal preferences for strategic considerations. The clock chimed midnight as they turned to discussing timeline considerations that would affect any potential transition. Royal schedules were planned years in advance, with state visits, ceremonial obligations, and constitutional requirements creating complex logistics that couldn't be easily modified. Any abdication would need to be timed around these commitments while also considering political events, public holidays, and media cycles that might affect public reception. Spring might offer the best opportunity, William suggested, his analytical mind working through the calendar. After the Christmas holidays, but before summer engagements become too intensive, it would allow time for proper preparation while avoiding major state occasions that would complicate timing. The practical planning helped both men process the emotional weight of their discussion by focusing on manageable details rather than overwhelming implications. Charles found himself studying his son's face in the lamplight, seeing echoes of his own younger self combined with qualities inherited from Diana and developed through William's unique experiences. The Prince of Wales possessed a natural authority that Charles had struggled to develop, along with communication skills better suited to modern media requirements. Perhaps most importantly, William and Catherine had achieved a positive public image, that could help modernize the monarchy's appeal to younger generations. If we proceed down this path, Charles said slowly, the actual moment of transition would be private, just between us. The public ceremonies would follow later, but the essential transfer of authority should happen here, in family, away from cameras and crowds. The idea of intimate succession appealed to both men, offering dignity and control that public spectacles often lacked. William picked up his ring, studying its surface, as if seeing it for the first time. The weight of these rings represents more than jewelry, he observed. They're symbols of promises made to millions of people across multiple nations. Transferring that responsibility requires absolute certainty that we're making the right choice. His words reflected the gravity both men felt about potentially altering centuries of royal tradition. Certainty may be impossible, Charles admitted. But we can strive for wisdom, and wisdom sometimes requires acknowledging limitations rather than pretending they don't exist. The question isn't whether I'm capable of being king, but whether the monarchy needs a different kind of leadership than I can provide at this stage of my life. The honest assessment came easier now. After hours of careful conversation had created space for uncomfortable truths. As the night deepened around Windsor Castle, father and son continued exploring the implications of a decision that could reshape British history. The sovereign's ring remained on the table between them, patient symbol of authority, waiting to learn its destiny. Outside their private sanctuary, the world continued its normal rhythm, unaware that two men were carefully planning changes that would affect millions of lives across multiple continents. The most difficult conversations often happened in quiet moments, away from public scrutiny, where honesty became possible and tradition could be questioned without immediate consequences. Tonight had been one of those conversations, opening possibilities that had previously existed only in theoretical discussions. The crown that had seemed too heavy for one king might soon find another head, but only after every consideration had been weighed with the care that such momentous decisions required. 3 weeks had passed since that pivotal evening conversation, and the wheels of constitutional machinery had begun turning with the discreet efficiency that characterized royal administration. Sir Clive Alderton had assembled a small team of constitutional experts, legal advisors, and trusted palace officials who could explore theoretical scenarios without triggering unwanted speculation. These conversations happened in private dining rooms and secure offices where Britain's most sensitive governmental business was routinely conducted. Charles found himself experiencing an unexpected sense of liberation as the practical aspects of potential abdication became clearer. The legal mechanisms, while complex, were manageable. The constitutional precedents, though limited, provided adequate framework for orderly transition. Most surprisingly, preliminary discussions with senior government officials had revealed more flexibility than anticipated regarding royal succession outside the traditional pattern of death-triggered change. The Prime Minister, when approached hypothetically, had indicated that governmental cooperation would be available if such extraordinary circumstances arose. Dr. Margaret Whitfield's weekly visits had become routine, her medical bag and gentle manner now familiar fixtures in Charles's private schedule. The treatment protocol she had designed was showing promising early results, but the physical demands remained significant. Energy levels fluctuated unpredictably, making reliable scheduling of royal duties increasingly difficult. More concerning were the cognitive effects of treatment, subtle changes in concentration and memory that could compromise his effectiveness in constitutional matters requiring absolute precision.
Your Majesty, Doctor?
Whitfield said during their most recent consultation, the treatment is progressing well, but we must be realistic about the timeline and demands. Full recovery will take many months, and even then, your energy levels may never return to their previous capacity. This isn't necessarily limiting for many activities, but for someone carrying your level of responsibility. She left the sentence unfinished, her medical expertise suggesting what royal protocol prevented her from stating directly. The conversation with William had produced unexpected results beyond their immediate family circle. Catherine had proven remarkably insightful about the strategic timing and public relations aspects of potential change. Her background in communications providing valuable perspective on managing complex announcements. Their children, while too young to understand constitutional implications, had adapted well to increased security measures and modified schedules that would become permanent features of their lives if their father became king. Perhaps most significantly, William had initiated careful conversations with key Commonwealth leaders, exploring their perspectives on succession timing, without revealing specific plans. The responses had been uniformly supportive of whatever decision best served long-term institutional stability. Several prime ministers had quietly indicated that younger leadership might actually strengthen ties between their nations and the British Crown, particularly given William and Catherine's positive international profile. The technical aspects of abdication had proved less daunting than expected. Constitutional lawyers had identified clear procedures for voluntary renunciation of the crown. Though these had never been tested in modern circumstances, Parliament would need to pass special legislation recognizing the abdication and confirming the succession. But this was considered a formality rather than a political obstacle. The various oaths of allegiance taken by military personnel, government officials, and others would require updating, but administrative machinery existed to manage such transitions efficiently. More complex were the international implications affecting the 15 Commonwealth realms that recognized the British monarch as their head of state. Each nation would need to formally recognize the succession, though this too was largely procedural. Canadian officials had indicated strong support for continuity, while Australian Republicans saw opportunity in leadership change. The Caribbean realms presented mixed responses, some viewing transition as natural evolution, while others questioned whether continued monarchy served their developing national identities. Charles had insisted on personally informing other members of the royal family before any public announcements, recognizing that family unity would be crucial for institutional credibility. Princess Anne had received the news with characteristic directness, immediately offering practical support for whatever decision served the monarchy's interests. Prince Edward and Sophie had expressed concern about timing but pledged complete cooperation. Most challenging would be the eventual conversation with Harry, whose physical distance from family events wouldn't excuse his exclusion from such momentous decisions. The logistical planning had revealed surprising complexity in seemingly simple royal transitions. Thousands of documents bearing royal signatures would need updating, from military commissions to judicial appointments. State portraits would require replacement across government buildings throughout Britain and the Commonwealth. Even seemingly minor details like royal stamps and currency designs would eventually need modification, though such changes could be implemented gradually over several years. Public opinion research conducted discreetly through established polling organizations had provided encouraging data about potential succession scenarios. While specific questions about abdication weren't asked to avoid speculation, general polling about royal succession and William's readiness for increased responsibility showed strong public confidence. Younger demographics, traditionally less supportive of monarchy, expressed particularly positive views about William and Catherine's leadership potential, suggesting that transition might actually strengthen the institution's long-term viability. The financial implications required careful consideration, as abdication would affect civil list payments, property arrangements, and the complex web of trusts and investments that supported royal activities. Charles would retain significant personal wealth, but would need to transfer various official assets and responsibilities to his successor. These arrangements, while complicated, were manageable through existing legal frameworks that had been developed over centuries of royal property management. International reaction to news of potential abdication would likely focus on Britain's stability and the Commonwealth's future rather than personal family dynamics. Diplomatic channels had been quietly prepared for rapid communication with key allies once any decision became final, ensuring that Britain's international relationships wouldn't be disrupted by unexpected royal changes. The United States, European Union, and other major partners had all indicated through informal channels that royal succession wouldn't affect broader diplomatic relationships. Charles found himself spending more time in private reflection, walking through Windsor's gardens where he could think without interruption from official duties or well-meaning advisors. The decision was becoming clearer with each passing day, driven not by weakness, but by strategic assessment of what the monarchy needed to thrive in coming decades. His reign, though shorter than anticipated, could still serve the institution's interests by demonstrating that royal duty sometimes required surrender rather than persistence. The moment of final decision arrived during a quiet Sunday morning when palace routines relaxed enough to allow unscheduled time for contemplation. Charles sat in his private study, reviewing the accumulated research and recommendations that had filled 3 weeks of intensive preparation. The constitutional path was clear, the family support was solid, the practical arrangements were manageable, and the timing seemed optimal for institutional interests rather than personal convenience. He reached for his telephone, dialing William's private number, with fingers that trembled slightly, from treatment side effects but not from uncertainty about the path ahead. The conversation would be brief, confirming decisions that both men had been approaching gradually through weeks of careful planning. The sovereign's ring would soon meet a new finger, but the transition would serve the crown's interests rather than merely accommodating one king's limitations. "William," Charles said when his son answered, "I think it's time we move from theoretical discussions to concrete planning. Are you and Catherine prepared for the changes ahead?" The question carried weight beyond its simple phrasing, representing the moment when possibility became intention, and private conversations became historical inevitability. The answer, when it came, would set in motion events that would reshape the British monarchy for generations to come. But the groundwork had been laid carefully, with attention to constitutional requirements, family harmony, and institutional stability that would help ensure success. The crown that had seemed too heavy for one king was about to find another, and the transition would demonstrate that wisdom sometimes required acknowledging limitations rather than denying them. The morning of December 15th arrived with unusual stillness, as if Windsor Castle itself recognized the historical significance of what would unfold within its ancient walls. Charles had chosen this date carefully, after the Christmas obligations that marked the royal calendar, but before the new year that would bring different challenges. The timing allowed for proper ceremony without conflicting with state occasions, while providing enough distance from his medical diagnosis to avoid appearing pressured by health concerns rather than strategic thinking. William arrived at 9 o'clock precisely, accompanied by Catherine but not their children, who remained at their Norfolk residence under increased security arrangements. The Prince and Princess of Wales wore formal morning dress appropriate for the occasion, their appearance carefully calculated to convey both solemnity and continuity. Catherine carried herself with the quiet dignity she had perfected over years of royal service, understanding that today marked her transformation from Princess of Wales to Queen Consort. Though public announcement would wait until later, the private ceremony took place in the throne room, chosen for its historical significance rather than its public grandeur. Charles had specifically requested that no cameras record these moments, insisting that the actual transfer of authority should remain intimate between father and son, while formal ceremonies could follow later for constitutional purposes. Sir Clive Alderton served as witness along with the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose presence provided religious blessing for a transition that had no modern precedent in British history. Charles began by reading a formal statement he had crafted over many weeks, each word chosen to explain his decision in terms of institutional service rather than personal limitation. After careful consideration and extensive consultation, I have determined that the Crown's interests are best served by my voluntary relinquishment of royal authority to my heir, who is better positioned to lead the monarchy through the challenges and opportunities ahead. The language was deliberately formal, but his voice carried genuine emotion as he spoke words that ended his reign after barely 2 years. The actual moment of transfer was surprisingly simple, involving no ancient rituals or complex ceremonies, but rather the quiet exchange of symbols that had represented royal authority for centuries. Charles removed the sovereign's ring from his finger for the final time, holding it briefly in his palm as if measuring its weight one last time. This ring has been worn by our predecessors through triumph and crisis, representing duty that transcends any individual monarch's reign. Today it passes to hands better suited to carry that responsibility forward. William accepted the ring with visible emotion, understanding that this simple gold band connected him to centuries of royal service, while simultaneously marking his assumption of burdens that would reshape every aspect of his family's future. The ring slid onto his finger with surprising ease, as if recognizing its rightful place after years of waiting. Father, I accept this responsibility with full awareness of its demands and complete commitment to serving the institution you have preserved and strengthened during your reign. The religious component of the ceremony was brief but meaningful, with the Archbishop offering prayers for both the abdicating monarch and his successor. These blessings, while not constitutionally required, provided spiritual framework for a transition that affected not just governmental structures, but the religious establishment that recognized the monarch as supreme governor of the Church of England. The prayers asked for wisdom in leadership and grace in service, themes that resonated deeply with both men's understanding of royal duty. Following the private ceremony, constitutional formalities required immediate attention to prevent any gap in royal authority that might create legal complications. Documents had been prepared in advance, requiring only signatures to make the abdication legally binding and the succession constitutionally valid. The paperwork was extensive but largely ceremonial, as the substantial legal work had been completed during weeks of preparation by government lawyers and constitutional experts. The Prime Minister arrived at noon for the formal notification of governmental leaders, bringing with him senior cabinet members who would need to adjust their own oaths of allegiance to recognize the new monarch. This meeting, while constitutional necessity, had been prepared through careful advance discussions that ensured governmental cooperation rather than political crisis. The transition had been framed as strengthening constitutional monarchy rather than admitting its weakness under previous leadership. News management had been planned with precision that reflected years of royal media experience and contemporary understanding of information cycles. The announcement would be released simultaneously across all major platforms at 6 o'clock that evening, allowing time for proper governmental coordination, while minimizing speculation that might arise from delayed revelation. International partners had been informed through diplomatic channels, ensuring that foreign governments learned of the change through official communication rather than media reports. Charles found the afternoon strangely peaceful, experiencing relief that surprised him with its intensity. The weight that had pressed on his shoulders for months had lifted, replaced by different but more manageable concerns about his future role and relationship with the institution he had served his entire life. The title of King Charles III would remain historically accurate, though his reign would be remembered as one of the shortest in British history. Yet length of service wouldn't necessarily determine historical significance if the transition strengthened royal institutions for future generations. William spent his first hours as King William V in meetings with private secretaries and constitutional advisors who needed to adjust their procedures for new leadership. The transition in personnel would be gradual, allowing experienced staff to maintain continuity while slowly incorporating the new monarch's preferred working methods and priorities. Catherine, now Queen Catherine, met separately with household officials to discuss her expanded role and the practical adjustments required for their children's security and education. The public announcement at 6 o'clock created immediate global attention, though reaction was generally positive due to careful preparation and strategic timing. News organizations had been provided with comprehensive background materials explaining the constitutional process and emphasizing the planned nature of the transition rather than any crisis requiring emergency action. Editorial responses from major newspapers were largely supportive, focusing on the smooth succession rather than questions about the previous monarch's health or capability. International reaction followed predictable patterns, with Commonwealth realms expressing continued loyalty to the crown while Republican movements in various countries claimed vindication for their positions. However, the orderly transition actually strengthened arguments for constitutional monarchy by demonstrating its flexibility and adaptability compared to other governmental systems where leadership change often created instability or controversy. Family reactions varied according to each member's personality and relationship to the central figures. Princess Anne issued a statement praising both her brother's service and his wisdom in ensuring smooth succession. Prince Edward and Sophie offered private support, while maintaining public discretion about family matters. Most significantly, Harry released a statement from California expressing love for his father and support for his brother, suggesting that major family events could still bridge personal divisions when institutional interests were at stake. The immediate practical effects were surprisingly minimal, as most royal duties continued unchanged, while administrative adjustments proceeded gradually. William's first weeks as king would focus on maintaining established schedules, while slowly implementing his own priorities and working methods. The coronation would be planned for the following year, allowing time for proper preparation while avoiding unseemly haste that might suggest institutional uncertainty about the transition. Charles retained the title of King Charles III but relinquished all constitutional authority, creating a situation unique in modern British history, where a former monarch lived as a private citizen, while his successor assumed full royal responsibility. This arrangement, while unprecedented, had been carefully planned to avoid conflicts of authority or public confusion about who held ultimate constitutional power. As evening settled over Windsor Castle, Charles sat once again in his private study, but now as a former king whose greatest service to the monarchy might have been his willingness to step aside when duty demanded sacrifice rather than persistence. The crown that had seemed too heavy for his aging shoulders now rested securely on his son's head, where it might serve the institution better than stubborn adherence to tradition would have allowed. The sovereign's ring gleamed on William's finger as Britain's new king prepared for responsibilities that would define the monarchy's future. The transition had been accomplished with dignity, careful planning, and genuine commitment to institutional welfare rather than personal preference. History would judge whether this unprecedented decision strengthened or weakened the crown. But the immediate result was clear. The British monarchy had demonstrated its ability to adapt when tradition conflicted with practical necessity. Outside the castle walls, the United Kingdom continued its daily life largely unchanged, though now under the rule of King William V rather than King Charles III. The crown had passed to a new generation, and the institution would either thrive or struggle based on the wisdom of this extraordinary decision made in a quiet room where duty ultimately prevailed over pride.